Hello and welcome to episode 5, Her Finance Talk. My name is Sue Diamond and I'm your host. And our goal is to help women create a better relationship with their money so you can live your best life. Thanks for joining us and investing in your financial well-being. The Her Finance Talk is brought to you by the Her Finance Club, and our mission is to socialize the idea that it's okay for women to talk about money, because knowledge is power, and when that knowledge helps you become more independent, it translates to empowerment. Women empowering women is a mantra we love to live by, and one that has helped inspire women for decades. Where would we be without each other? So today, let me welcome our guest, Dr. Joy Wiggins, founder and CEO of Joy Wiggins Equity and Inclusion Consulting, which provides speaking, facilitation, and mentorship opportunities on the topics of power, privilege, racial and gender justice, and liberation. Joy has spent the last 20 years working on understanding how our cultural identities and perceptions of how we navigate the world through cultural identities. And amongst her many talents, you can watch her in action on her TED Talk, which I'll share in the show notes, and also check out her book, which I think she has in the background, From Sabotage to Support, a new vision for feminist solidarity in the workplace. There you go. And her goal is to facilitate transformative learning opportunities infused with empathy, education, and liberation for all. So I would want to start by saying thank you for joining us today. This is great. And I'd love to open up the conversation, Joy, and just have you share a little bit about your story, because that was a quick overview on my part, and tell our listeners a little bit about you and how you ended up where you are today in terms of your business.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. And I do want to note that this is a co-authored book with Dr. Camille Anderson. And as we talk about solidarity and feminism today, it's something that we really pride ourselves in the book, is that we have come together, and how do women come together across many differences. So that is that's something that like you said, out of the TED Talk that I did, I was about to write this book by myself. And then I have Dr. Camille Anderson and I have been friends for a while. And so we decided, I said, you know what, we've been wanting to do a project together. And I think if I'm talking about women and solidarity, I might need another voice in here. So that's how that started. So like I said, I got my TED Talk finished, and then we did this book. We worked on the book after that. So there's a lot more that it piggybacks off of the TED Talk. But to kind of go back to your question about my background, I have a social justice and education doctorate from Ohio State, and I'm a teacher, and I teach in the teacher education department at Western Washington University now, but I also have a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting business. And what's nice about that is that the things that I teach at the university around culture, equity, and advocacy inform, and vice versa, my consulting business. So I've worked mostly in the tech industry, but I've also worked a lot in higher education through my consulting, where I do strategic planning, executive coaching, leadership programming. I've written women's leadership programs for local nonprofits. I'm currently here in Austin. But I was also had a lot of clients in Seattle, Washington, and Bellingham, Washington, where I moved actually just recently from. So I think that's probably the most that I can tell you, is that I have learned so much throughout this time working on this book, but also through my consulting. And it's opened up even more apertures of understanding, even since I've written the book, and even since I did the TED Talk. And it's just been this, incredible, I hesitate to say journey, but because that's so overused, but that is kind of what it is. Adventure, I'll say.
Right. Yeah, well, just to let our listeners know, so you and I met, we connected on LinkedIn, and you very graciously volunteered to meet with me as I was reaching out to connect with women to do research for my book for women creating a better relationship with their money. And then hence got introduced to your TED talk and your book. So it's great. The COVID, there was some not so great moments, and it impacted a lot of people in a negative way, but also on the other side, I'd look at, I made some great friends virtually, just
Yeah.
because of the nature of the beast. So got to look at the positive side as well. So right now, we know women are bearing the greater economic burden following 2020 and COVID-19 in terms of lost wages and lost work.
Mhm.
But for me to top that, this economic crisis has been years in the making, really. And I say that because women are most affected because they were in a worse financial position than men long before this pandemic occurred. And just on average, and I use the term average because it varies based on your culture. Women in general are paid 18% less than men in the US. And of course, we know for women of color and Hispanic women that it's even less again. But the other side is that women put about, I think it's 30% less money away in terms of savings. So the
Mhm.
financial picture, for me, is becoming even more dire because of the economic impact from COVID and just in terms of what women are experiencing right now. And one of the things I saw, I think it was Alivest, that they were talking about, they were saying that the pandemic is actually going to put women 20 years back even more in terms of the gender pay gap, just because when we're out of work, kind of, they say, I think it's 12 months, that potentially when you go back, then you could have a loss of 7% in terms of being able to negotiate in terms of your skill set and knowledge. But I'm really excited to talk to you today about how we can be more supportive of other women, how we as women can be supportive of other women in the workplace by having a better understanding of gender bias. And just to share with our listeners, I was blown away after I listened to your TED talk. And again, I'm going to share it in the show notes. You have to listen to this because a light bulb went off for me that made so much sense when you talked about sabotage and how kind of our negative talk and our self-imposter syndrome in terms of that lack of confidence actually can regurgitate itself back out and land on other women in the form of sabotage, just in terms of, because if we don't believe we belong, then neither do other women. So I would love for you to expand on that and share with our listeners about that. And I know you have some great call to actions, but I love how you title some of the things. You talked about articulate, which I thought was great, and deconstructing it. But yeah, please, expand on that because it really is something that all women need to kind of really start to have an understanding about.
Right. So, one of the things that I talk about a lot is that when we are under social conditions that generate a particular social norm of what women are expected to do, how we're expected to act, and all of this comes from our collective history. And then, of course, this varies according to the racial or ethnic groups that you're a part of, where you grew up, the time period you grew up. Um, your family status, your family structure, your economic status, all of those things inform who we are as people and most certainly as women. So even though we're a part of a collective of women under that identity marker of women, we still have very, very, very different experiences. And each of those layers of who we are and our cultural identities along racial, ethnicity, linguistic, age, generational, class, ability, language, all of those things inform how we experience the world and how the world experiences us. So when we when we do navigate different workplace situations, it's really important that we, children, speaking of COVID, we'll talk about that in a minute. They can't help it. They got to come in when you're in the middle of something. So, what happens is that we don't realize that it's really the structure that is keeping us down in a way. And that is white supremacy, that is patriarchy. Those are those systems. And in the TED Talk, I talk about how that's an umbrella. And under that umbrella is our institutions, and that's our healthcare system, education, our political and legal justice system. All of those things fall underneath that structure. And if we start to really understand our history and understand how women's voices have been taken out of the structuring and the organization of those structures from our government, from even looking at the way women have been treated throughout time, especially in the United States, but in Europe as well. And of course, other countries still. The way that there's very little matriarchal communities still around. And there are some, of course, but when patriarchy took over, it really eliminated the voices that were so necessary. And for not only along gendered lines, but racial lines as well. All of those things really fall under this umbrella of the structures and the power systems. And when we start to realize that that is not a part of imposter syndrome is difficult. And Jodi Amburi and Rashika Tulshun talk about this, about how we should stop calling it the imposter syndrome, because it's really not us and we're not the problems. And so we keep thinking, oh, it's me and I have to fix me. But really, it's the system that's the problem. And it's fixing the system that creates the inequity in the first place. So, but I think as women, the best way that we can empower ourselves is to realize that it's not us, that it is actually the system that has created an equitable system that sets us up to hit barrier after barrier after barrier. And then you have things like pandemics, and then you have things like recessions and housing crisis, and all of these different things that that continually keep us behind. And the pay gap is another big one that you talked about, and it does. And if you think about it, Latinx women make half of what white men do, and so already you've got that 50 cents to the dollar that's kept them behind again and again and again. And like you said, COVID has just made it worse.
Yeah. And I do find, I think the other thing is tying back, and I totally get your point in terms of the imposter syndrome. We think it's us, but I find when I think about that, or the lack of confidence that women have that holds them back from even negotiating a salary,
Yes.
because I mean, that's part of, I think for me, until we have more transparency around this and women feel comfortable talking about it, it's going to take much, much longer to be able to close that gap.
Absolutely. And that's the other thing with this understanding of how do we empower ourselves and know what we have the rights to. I had this great meeting yesterday with an HR generalist, and she said, there's actually settlement packages that you can get when you leave a job. I didn't know that. As an academic, that's never even been brought up. And how do you negotiate those things? So, and also just knowing your rights, just knowing your
Yeah.
basic employment law, knowing your rights, knowing the functions of the organizations, like HR and the different departments within your organization, understanding those, looking at recruitment and retention practices. One client I was speaking to, I was looking at helping them leverage their collective power along their ERGs, their employee resource groups. And I said, the whole point that, first of all, you have to have an ERG group to begin with is problematic, right? Because that's already
Right.
saying we have to have a special position. So already we're recognizing that there's inequity because we have to have employee resource groups. And then not only that, but then when folks do join those groups, they're not necessarily always commended for that. that it almost feels like you already have this oppression and now you've got to join this group in order to feel like you're resourcing and being with others that are experiencing the same thing. But now that's more time out of your day. And that's more times that you are going out looking for speakers and having events with your ERG, trying to
Right.
negotiate better salaries, better workplace policies and procedures. All of those things are now more added, compounded time
Right.
that's already on the oppression that you're already experiencing. And so one of the things that when I talk about action steps is looking at the power of ERGs and making sure that the C-suite is accountable for when you do participate in those, that you're actually being, commended for that. And
Right.
that's, maybe part of your promotional package.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, that makes total sense. I mean, and I've just, after COVID, I'm seeing more, I guess, in terms of human resource directors, they're not using that. It's the diversity and inclusion officer, and
Hmm.
it's like, this has been happening for years, but now corporations and businesses are finally starting to get a bit more focused on it. But as you say, it's like, wow, having to create positions, really highlights the issue that's been there all along. So it's like,
Yeah. And I also think that when you have diversity, so a lot of companies after George Floyd, especially this summer, a lot of companies like, oh, we have to do this now. I don't know why it had to take George Floyd on video. But finally, some companies are giving a nod to the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion.
right,
And the only issue with that is that there's all these positions out there now for VPs, directors, program managers for diversity, equity, inclusion. But what they're not doing is they're not providing the infrastructure necessarily. They're just saying, oh, here's a job position. Here's all of these things that go along with it that really should be a team of people.
right,
And I've been through this job process. Like I've been looking for these positions, and what I've noticed is that some companies, have a pretty solid team, except for they're still not moving the needle as much. They'll show metrics on their websites and they'll show how much the demographics are changing. But what you'll still see is that, yeah, they'll show the demographics and they might have lower level positions that are more diverse, but those C-suite positions are still quite white male or white
right,
women. And so even though it's important for us to understand that collective history of how white feminism has actually divided women, and
right,
even with the women's march and all of those different things that have been happening, a lot of that's been white women advocating for white women and not necessarily making, expanding that circle so that
right,
we understand all women's issues, indigenous women's issues, Pacific Islander women's issues, Black, Asian American, LGBTQI folks, the transgender movement, all of those things. And those are things that we talk about in the book is let's take a look at the collective history of women and the folks that were already doing all of this work that really haven't been put in the mainstream talking points along the women's movement. It's been
right,
Susan B. Anthony. It's been, Elizabeth Cady Stanton as the suffrage movement. But what we haven't looked at is Ida B. Wells and Sojourner Truth and all these women that have been doing that work even before Susan B. Anthony
right.
and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so that's something that we wanted to center that in the book is that the more that we know about our collective history and the more that we know how divided we've been, the better able we are able to support each other when we know that me as a white woman, I'm not having the same experience as Camille, who is a Black woman,
Right.
or older women, or women with different abilities, or transgender folks. All of these things are important for us to know and understand, and know that we don't have to have all the answers, but we know that there's a difference and that we have a different
Yeah.
history and that what
Yeah.
you're facing might be very different than what I'm facing. And if I can understand your experience better, then I'm able to collectively activate for all of us. And same for everybody else in the room. The more that we know about each other, the better that we're able to really understand, oh, I'm not having that same experience. So like with COVID, me having to yell at my child. um, because they can't help it. They just come running in here. They're 10 years old. And, I'm lucky enough that my child has been in school. But when COVID first hit and then we had Zoom school and I was trying to figure out my own classes and my business, pivoting my business, I lost
Mm,
clients. It was such a huge drain.
yeah,
And that was important for me to better understand the moms that were having to still do Zoom school at home and also
yeah,
and that didn't have support. And I'm a single mom too, so I'm doing it all by myself. And just understanding that I think we're extending more grace to each other
right.
in these times on individual levels, but how does that really help us on systemic levels?
Yeah. So I wanted to go back and just as you were mentioning in terms of, understanding other women that are not necessarily a part of one's own culture. And I think for me with COVID, with Black Lives Matter, I was doing some broadcasting and I interviewed 4 women of color to talk specifically about, how is this impacting you? How is your life? Because I never really thought about it. I'd always talk about the gender pay gap, 80 cents to the dollar. Well, that's white women. That's not women of
Right.
color or Hispanic women. And I said, you know what? I never really thought about it. I'd be talking about this, but I didn't really think, but my white privilege, I could get it was less than white males, but I was still earning more than women of color in some instances and Hispanic women. And it's like, I really need to understand and stop kind of, I wouldn't ask a question because I think, oh, it might be impolite or I don't want to upset the person. But the thing is, I have to have an understanding of where that person's coming from in order to effectively be as supportive as I can.
Mhm.
So it really is kind of recognizing, as you say, what we all have different experiences based on our different ethnicities. And I think you get into with the check your privilege and the intersecting of social
Mhm.
identities, thinking about, well, there's female, but then your ethnicity, and then there's able bodied versus disabled. And so
Mhm.
it's, I think I loved the when you talked about the deconstructing the ticker tape because we do rely on all these like mental shortcuts, right, to
Mhm.
simplify everything around us. And gender stereotypes are one of those mental shortcuts. And I think, that often leads us to make biased assumptions that often we don't really. I think in a lot of instances it's not always conscious, I think, as you say. So I mean, would you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that's the key. We have these unconscious assumptions that are biased and don't even think about it.
Right. And we are all swimming in the same water.
Yeah,
So, and Camille puts this in part of the book when we talk about that intercultural solidarity as well. Because because we're women, we're not unaware of what the expectations of women. So when we look at body image, when we look, I mean, that's such a big one, right? And
yeah,
how do we check each other as women? So one of the things that it's a great organization called the Embody Love Movement. And I did a training for that. Now I'm a facilitator for them. And what we learned with that was that when you are, let's say, at a buffet table and you are saying, oh, I really shouldn't be eating that, or oh, I'm going to grab this, but I shouldn't, or talking about what somebody else is eating, like, oh, I wish I could eat that. Like, stop doing that because what that
right,
does is that it continually checks each other. So what I'm doing to that person when I say something like that, or if I say, "Oh, I'm so fat," or "Oh, I feel this way," I'm saying, "You're not good either." Because if I
yeah,
look this way, and I probably look just fine, but when you say that, you're adding to that narrative that women have to look a particular way. So when you denigrate yourself, you denigrate the people around you as well. And I think that's really powerful because when we don't have that self-esteem and that empowerment within ourselves, then, well, like you said, it regurgitates back onto other women. And so when I talked about the ticker tape, or this idea of this running commentary that's in your head, and even like, I can see on any like CNN or any Fox or whatever you're listening to, anything that when you see that scrolling thing about the stock market underneath, that's what's going on in our brains all the time. We're making judgments. Human beings, it's very normal for us to do that. We have to categorize things. We're constantly making sense of our surroundings. And when we're tired, distracted, or multitasking, our ticker tape will come out even faster. So a lot of times you'll see things like microaggressions that come out that might be like those little tiny little stabs that we do to someone else, like saying, oh, in the elevator, for instance, for my TED Talk, when the woman came in and said, oh my gosh, you were so big before, you lost a ton of weight. And that was just such, first, why is my body a focal image at work? And why is that so? I mean, women, we already have enough problems with our bodies and our image and the way that we see ourselves. So it's really hard. We're hard enough on ourselves. So when other women say things, and even though we think, oh, that might be a nice compliment to say, oh, you lost weight. But really what that's saying is that you were heavy before and you look better when you're skinny. You look better when you're lighter. So what does that say when we gain that weight back? Or when we, don't look our best all the time, or when we're not feeling great? And even mental health is all a part of that. So it's really important to look at what we're thinking and the ways in which that ticker tape is running constantly in our head, what we're saying about ourselves, what we're saying about other women, the way we judge other people, our own, socialization, the stereotypes that come up. And if we don't catch them, if we're not aware of what's happening in our head and we don't catch them, they come out of our mouth or in our actions. And that's what, is really why you have to have, all this training, because of the things that people are saying. And if they're not aware, they're not self-aware and self-reflective. And it's not saying that you're wrong and you have to be blamed and shamed for, we all have these embedded storylines in our heads and in our lives and in our socializations that are a part of our society, that have just informed, and those little identity markers of our race, class, gender, ethnicity, age, all of those things are just those little filters. And so those are just informing the way that you're moving through the world. And the more aware we are of the way we've been socialized and the way it comes through our thinking and then our actions, the better able we are to be in solidarity with other women, because we're now starting to really take a deep dive into what we are experiencing and the ways that we've been shaped and why we do the things that we do. And whenever I've had my students do that as an activity, they had to go for a week and just really look at that ticker tape. And for them, they just came back. I said, so what'd you learn? And they're like, oh my gosh, I'm my worst enemy, is what they really found. And also that they did, just when they were tired, or they just weren't really pausing and breathing and thinking about what they were seeing and thinking, they would say something or do something or have a quick judgment that they knew was a stereotype. So that's basically what that's about.
Oh, wow. Well, I mean,
I can go, Susan. I can go.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I mean, I could talk to you about this all day. You are just a wealth of knowledge, and it isn't till you start thinking about it, it's like, yeah, what? And when you say your own worst enemy, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm always saying, oh, I shouldn't have that piece of cake, but all right, I'm going to eat it anyway. And I'm like, why am I saying I shouldn't have that piece of cake?
And it's also scarcity. It's this my idea that women don't deserve things. So when we say that to ourselves, we think that we don't deserve it. We don't deserve that salary. We don't deserve, and that is that is not us. That is the system. And so it's another author that's really good is Sonia Renee Joy. And she, I have the book. She's another Barrett Kohler author with us. And she talks about what's at the root of that. And to really look at what's the root of that thing I just said, whether it's about myself or somebody else. Or, what's at the root of that? What system is at the root of that? Is that patriarchy? Is that white supremacy? Is that ableism? Is that, what is at the root of that? And if I can get to that, then I can start to pick apart the stuff that doesn't serve me.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny because when I think about it, that's what I do in terms of money and our relationships with money. So I'm always saying, we can't do any effective planning until we understand what our money story is and how we value money. And
Mhm.
it really is taking clients back and looking at, okay, what were some of those verbal and nonverbal messages you were picking up as a child? Because our money stories are created by the time we're 8 or 9 years of age. So yeah, it's kind of, doing that psychology and digging deep into, okay, there's a reason why you have certain behaviors around money, and it stems from your money story. And people are like, my what?
Oh, for sure. And also watching your parents and your mothers, and how did your mothers, I think really looking at your mothers and the mother figures in your lives, and the women that were in your life, and how did they negotiate all those things?
Yeah.
Those were your mentors, really.
Yeah. 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 Well, I'm sorry we're going to have to end, but we'll have to have you come back so we can talk more about this. And I just, I think, when women can live the lives they've always dreamed of, create that generational wealth and lift each other up, that's when real societal change, I think, becomes possible. So tell our listeners where they can find you, Joy.
Well, you can go to my website. It's www.joywiggins.com. I'm mostly on LinkedIn. I'm trying to do more social media. But my website's the best place. There's a contact page there. But again, that's joywiggins.com. Our book is called From Sabotage to Support, A New Vision for Feminist Solidarity in the Workplace. And you can get that I try to promote local bookstores. But Book People from here in Austin, or Goodreads is another great place to find the book. Or you could go to the Barrett Kohler. We also do lots of book talks and clubs. So we're happy to come and talk to people about it. And, just check us out on joywiggins.com.
Okay, and I'll put the information in the show notes for our listeners as well. So thank you so much for sharing your story and your knowledge and giving us some tidbits. And this was great. Thank you so much, Joy.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for having me.
And just let me take time to remind everyone that Her Finance Talk is brought to you by the Her Finance Club. And our goal is to get 1 million women to start the money conversation with spouse, friends, or colleagues, because knowledge is power. And when that knowledge helps you become more independent, it translates to empowerment. So thank you again to our listeners for taking time from your busy schedules to join us today. Until our next episode, here's to your financial well-being.